some identification. Okay. So, transects. Why do we do them? What do we want to know from our transects? The map that you see here, the red and blue dots, actually is all the transects in the UK. There's 3,000 what we call wider countryside butterfly transects and 2,000 what we call traditional UKBMS monitored. Now, the UKBMS transects have monitored for 26 weeks, and the WCBS are done roughly monthly, but a minimum of 2 per year. So what are we trying to measure with how we assess species? So there's two big factors that we're trying to measure, and that's occurrence and abundance. So occurrence is where species occur, obviously, and abundance is the change in the number of insects in that area. Often confused, and it's important that we understand why and how we measure each. So occurrence is our casual records. You know, if you see an insect and then you go and pop it in iRecord, send it to your county recorder, that's an occurrence. Now you might put, I've seen 3, you might see 5, etc. That is only really gives us a rough indication of abundance. What we really need to know is measure abundance in a quantitative way, so we can actually compare. The problem with casual records is we don't know how long a person's been counting butterflies. We don't know the temperature, whether the sun is out, what distance they walked, whether they counted everything they saw, etc. And it's very difficult to make any kind of real data from that. It's useful because it gives us where an insect species occurs. So a transect, the reason we do transects is we're trying to quantify that. So there's a very strict set of rules that we work to, which is the Pollard walk rules, which I'm not going to go into here. We're going to cover that on a later session, or you can look it up on the website. You can see the map now, which has all the dots, gives you an idea of the density of transects through the UK. Obviously, there's a very big preponderance in the south of England. Yorkshire is actually better than that. This is an old map. We're a bit better than that. Let me move on to the next slide. So the sites we monitor in Yorkshire, 2 maps here. The one on the left is the 2020 situation, showing all the green ticks are monitored sites, red crosses are old sites not monitored. The yellow areas, and the importance of this map is we did a study last year looking at the areas which were poorly covered, and I gave this meeting a overview of the conclusions of that report. But basically, in a nutshell, we found that the 3 key areas which were not really well represented in our transects was the Yorkshire Wolds, which are here, the Dearne Valley and the coal measures down here, but very importantly, this yellow line down here is the magnesium limestone ridge, which was poorly represented. Now you'll see on the right hand side the 2021 situation, and a lot of those names that I've read out are plugging some of those gaps. I'm really pleased to say we've well exceeded our target. We aimed for 5 new sites. We achieved 21 new sites. So we're well on our way to plugging the holes. And you can see all the new sites. In particular, now we have three monitored sites on the Yorkshire Wolds, 4 monitored sites in the coal measures, and I think 6 sites now on the magnesium limestone ridge. Most importantly, we have key sites like Brockadale, and it's nice to report Nosterfield also joined this year. So just to give you a background to our monitoring effort in Yorkshire. Yorkshire produces something like 76,000 records in the course of a year from 2,500 recorders. Now, quite a few of those will be things like the big butterfly count, and the majority, the other big number will be our casual recorders. So around about 70% of our records go into what's the occurrence records, go into what's known as the butterflies of the new millennium, which is a very high number, and 30% of the figures are what we're talking about tonight. Now, the key work that we do is this work, which is the abundance measurements. So we have 71 monitored sites, 21 new this year, so 45% rise since 2019. We have 9 WCBS squares. Those are random squares scattered through the countryside. The idea there is because they're chosen randomly, we get to know what's happening in farmland and all kinds of different habitats. We also have single species transects, which just cover obviously a single species usually during its flight period, like the northern brown argus and the large heath. I had a shock when I actually sat down and wrote down all our transect walkers and what their names were. I thought there was just over 100. When I actually got down and wrote them all out, there's 170 transect walkers out there doing about 4,000 hours, covering about 1,000 miles in walking, over 120 miles of transects. It's a very, very impressive set of figures. And you should all be congratulated as being a large part of that. We form the largest contribution that butterfly conservation volunteers make to the national figures. It dwarfs what we do in terms of conservation. So as I was saying, we've made good progress on our 2025 targets, particularly in our target landscapes, with extra 3 in the Wolds, an extra 2 in the lowland heath. So we have this year Alethorpe Common, magnesium limestone ridge, which I've described, and we also got some urban ones, which is great. I don't think we've got any representatives here tonight, but we've got an extra 3 actually in city centres. So these are green spaces. We'll have more next year, which is good news. Just to give you an idea here of the history of our transect walking in Yorkshire and the rapid change that we've seen in this last year. So we need to do any kind of work, really. We need about at least 30 or so transects in order to have any kind of realistic assessment for the whole county. And we really only reached that figure in about 2015. So our transect history is quite short. But you can see the big jump in this last year. This is an important one. This gives you an idea of the quality of the walking that we do. So this is split by year since 2016 in terms of, we know we have 26 weeks in the butterfly season, which starts the 1st of April, which this year falls on a Friday. It always falls on the same day number each year, so that each week thereafter can be compared year by year. And this year is a Friday. It changes every year. So you see here, the blue is where we've walked more than 20 weeks, which is excellent. Red is more than 15 weeks, which we can fill the gaps, but the data is not so good. Yellow, when you get down to less than 15 walks in a year, makes it very difficult to do the analysis because there's so many gaps in the year. So this is kind of looking at how we've fared over the years. Now, just to remind ourselves about last year and what the weather was like back in last May in particular, but April was very, very cold. And then of course, May, it rained almost for 3 weeks, almost solid. I lost, I know, 3 weeks walking in that period. And I know a lot of you lost 3, even 4, even 5 weeks during that period. So the blue is a little bit down because of that. But even so, all that is now useful. So we've now got well over 40 transects we can analyze. So we're making good progress there too. So a lot of us enter our data into the database, the UKBMS database. It appears to go into a black hole. We don't see much come back from it, apart from a few reports. Every 5 years, there's a quinquennial review, which you see here. Annually, DEFRA uses it to produce really good data on the biodiversity indicators. This goes towards the 25-year plan, which you probably might have heard of, which is looking at the idea of the 25-year plan after the Lawson report was to hand the nation something, the next generation, something better than this generation, and certainly not worse than this generation. So this plots how well we're doing against that ambition. These are more detailed analysis. Just to give you an idea how things are changing butterfly-wise. So this looks at the trends of the overall trend in all species, in this case on farmland, and how it varies a lot. With any insect, obviously there's very big peaks and troughs. They're very sensitive to temperature in particular, and hence experience very big changes in abundance, which you see here. And this is a plot of recent years from 1990 onwards. And for a long time, there's been a decrease, but then you can see as 2014 arrived into 2015, it began to change somewhat the other way. And we're going to talk a lot more about that shortly. At the same time that this was all happening, here's a little histogram showing the percentage of species that have increased and decreased. So you can see on the long term, quite a lot of species have decreased and only a few increased. In the short term, not too bad. Only about one species is showing two species is showing a decrease, and we still have a bit of an increase. And the reason for that is, I think you can see in the Yorkshire totals here, because that's a national figure, you can see the total. This is over our transects. You can actually see it climb towards the best year for a very long time, 2019, which is over here. You can see the peak, which you really have to go back to the mid-90s to see anything close to what we saw in 2019. And I think we'll all remember the summer of 2019 was quite exceptional. 2018 was also good, but things have gone down somewhat in recent years. Okay, moving on. I promised you a look at the 2021 season. And I think a lot of, judging by the number of mails that I got, a lot of you were really, once it got to the middle of June, it was almost Midsummer's Day, you really began to worry because there were very few butterflies about. And that was a big talking point this summer. We began to believe that it was going to be a very, very poor season. But really, was it as bad as we all think? So I hope to answer that question shortly. As I said, with any insect, the weather is always a key to what happens to our species. And these charts just give you a quick overview. We're not going to linger too long on this. A quick overview of the last couple of years, because what happened last year has a big influence on this year. So in terms of last year, you remember, sorry, 2020, when the pandemic started, it was a very mild winter, extremely mild winter, extremely wet in February. But then you probably remember, as soon as the pandemic struck, the sun came out, we had some very warm months. We had a rather chilly July, which is a very important month for butterflies. That's when so many of our species are on the wing. And you also notice we had a warm autumn. Rainfall wise, we can see the huge peak we had. Remember all the floods back in February 20. We also see here, and this is important, November. November is an important month for butterflies. It's when everything goes into hibernation. And if it's wet and it's warm, that's a very bad combination for a lot of our species that overwinter. They suffer disease. They're in and out of actually going into hibernation, and the casualties can be very high. Quick summary at the bottom there. 2021. So the season started quite chilly, very average February. And you might just remember, and this one's important, we had a bit of a heat wave in March. I think it was the last week in March, we had record temperatures. I think the mercury hit 26 degrees. Even in Yorkshire, we had quite a heat wave. But then you probably remember April, May, extremely, extremely cold. And then we went to actually quite a warm summer and a very warm autumn. In terms of rainfall, well, we won't forget the rains of last May. It was one of the wettest Mays on record. All this, you can feel the effect of this. And one of the factors we do measure in all this is the flight curves. And the comment that I was getting back from you transect walkers were, where are all the butterflies? Well, they were just straightforward, very late. So let's just have a quick look at how late some of our species were. So I've chosen 4 species, 2 whites, 2 browns, just to have a look at what happened. So the large white, you'll see a big gap here. So what you see here is the amount seen on our transects. And these are going to be the graphs that now appear in our annual review, published each year. This is number of insects seen on our, this is actually a percentage of total, so it's the whole of the year is 100%. And this is the percentage of the population that was seen for each week of the year. So that allows you to compare one year with another year. So here we're looking at the 2021 season compared with the 5-year average. And you see this big gap here, which is June into July. We were really quite low. You'll see the same with the small white, similar with the ringlet, and similar with the meadow brown. Put this all together and you get this, which is all the species. And you see this gap here is quite huge, but then you see this peak well above. So although we had a very bad June, there was more than ample compensation for it in July. So it's a very grim start, which is the other important bit. This bit down here in April and May, we had some really bad weeks when we weren't able to get out and walk, but because there were no butterflies there to count. The June lull, which those butterfly people will know is a tradition each year. There's always a gap between the spring species and the summer species. Normally it's about 1 week, 2 weeks in length. This year, I've never known anything like it. The June lull lasted the whole of June. But then you can see the catch-up boom was huge. So we had 3 weeks well below and then 3 weeks well above. So I'm going to hand now to Katherine in what we do with all the data as it comes in. First of all, I'd just like to introduce Katherine to you. Yeah, you're there. And say we're very pleased to welcome Katherine as our data officer. You may be aware that we've lost our county recorder. So Katherine is now holding the database of all the data for Yorkshire is held by her. She'll tell you all about herself. I'm going to hand to her now.
I'll share my screen.
You might need to speak up, Katherine.
Okay. Go.
Just get a bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Okay, is that better?
Better here.
Right. Okay. Yes, I'm Katherine Jones. I was on the committee for a while of Yorkshire Butterflies, and I look after the data. I had about 30 odd years working in data and maths before I retired, so it's right up my street. It's much nicer to look after butterflies than people, really, I suppose. So what we've started doing this year, which we hadn't done before, was actually analysing data in Yorkshire. In the past, our data had just gone into the black hole of the whole of the UK, which was great, and it still does, and it produces those reports that Nick showed you. But we thought it might be interesting to look at data just in Yorkshire and see what we could get. So we downloaded the data from the transects this year and also for the last 5 years. And when it comes off the system, this screen here is what it looks like if you ignore the green column. This is actually my transect, Wycliffe, and you get a row for each date and each species. So this is what it looks like. It's got transect, Wycliffe, grid reference, date, species, and the number that I saw. It's the same for every transect. They're all in a great big table. So that was the raw data. And then I tried to think what I could do with it, and Nick gave me loads of thoughts and ideas. And what I did was, first of all, do a summary. I'm going to the next screen. For each, so this is Wycliffe. This is what I did with it, first of all. I looked at each species each week across the top and looked at what I'd seen. Actually, sometimes it's quite interesting as well, because you forget what you've seen, or you have a false memory of what was prolific and what wasn't. I saw 410 small heaths, for example. I never would have thought it was that much spread over the weeks. You get to see the patterns. So I did that for every single transect. And then the next thing I did was add it all up the whole year. So this is all the transects put together. So you can see a phenomenal number of sightings, 43,000 at the bottom there. That's for all the transects put together. And you start to see some real patterns of what species that you've seen or have all seen put together, what's common and what isn't common. And I did the same for the last 5 years, 2016 up to 2020, to get a comparison. Anyway, fed that through into graphs. And these are the graphs that Nick's just been showing you. Loads of them, one for each species. For the rare species, I did something slightly different because I had to do a 20-year comparison just to get enough figures. But for the common species like large white, 5-year comparison was plenty. So I got the graphs and they're going in the annual report. And then we started to look at, could we see if things were up or down? So then next thing, we produced this spreadsheet. Red's bad, orange is sort of okay, and green is good. So for example, if I take my transect, which is further across, Whitcliffe there, small heaths are up, for example, ringlets are down. So this is just a kind of quick glance thing of what's up and what's down. We also counted the number of transects up, number of transects down. Now, and then produced a total overall figure. We haven't put every transect in there because what we looked for was ones that had quite a complete record over the last 6 years. So as transects get walked more and more, they'll gradually feed into this. So we just filtered it through a few times this time just to get the transects that have been walked a lot. You'll notice that some are referred to by numbers or initials, and that's because they're secret locations. And the landowners, for example, don't want us to publish names. I thought it made it a bit confusing when I was trying to do the figures, trying to have all these different keys of what was what. So that's what we've done. And hopefully as the years pass, we'll gradually get more and more transects into this as we get more and more data, and then the figures will get more accurate. Now, if you miss a week, it doesn't really matter too much because I can interpolate. I've got a formula for interpolating up to 2 weeks that are missing, just based on what's been seen either side. And if it's more than 2 weeks, I've got a formula to just roughly estimate what you might have seen in those weeks. Obviously, if you do walk it, it's better than me trying to guess what you might have seen if you had been there. But at least we've got a bit of a tool now for trying to put data together and patch it a little bit if it's a bit gappy. Anyway, all this is going into the annual report, so you can actually think you've actually seen the data before anybody else. Okay, Nick,
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Okay. Katherine underestimates what she's done and is far too modest. What she's actually done is a huge amount of work. I think she spent hundreds of hours coming up with the software to actually do that interpolation. It's actually quite a bit cleverer than what she describes. Obviously, when you have a 1 week gap or 2 week gap, it's very easy to draw just a straight line between those two figures, and then you know, interpolate what those figures should be. Life gets a little bit more complicated when you get to 3 weeks, because in 3 weeks you can almost miss the peak of a species. So we had to come up with a new system, and we really are lucky in Yorkshire to have the skills that Katherine from her actuary work to actually do this. So for each species, for each transect, there's a dummy graph, which is basically the flight pattern, which you saw earlier, for that species in each transect. So if you miss a few weeks, it's very easy then to turn to those dummy graphs and actually figure out what the figures should be. So it's a really powerful tool that she's created. We are very grateful for her skills. Thank you, Katherine.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes, I mean, it's better really if people walk it or get somebody else to walk it, because you can't really guess what somebody's seen. You can only do your best with a graph, really. You know, it's better if somebody's actually seen something.
Absolutely. Okay. So we're going to try and get to grips now with what happened species-wise in over the season and have a look at what might have been going on. So you've seen the figures and how they're manipulated and what comes out the other end. And this, I know it's big and it's a bit cumbersome, but we're just going to work down the species and just figure out what could be the key factors from the things we've already learned about the weather changes, and how they've affected our species. So you see here across in the table here, each of our species down the left here, and you also see the number of transects up, number of transects that are down, which gives you a good idea of which way a species is going. So these are our species trends, and we're looking at the different species groups in a little bit more detail. And you see over in the table, number of transects where the species go up. There's number of transects where they're kind of in the middle, neither yes, neither no, and the number that are going down. And this is done by count. So this is the average of all the transects which actually had that species present. Next over, you'll see what happened the previous year. And over here, just to add a little bit of perspective to it, the national trends. So let's look at a little bit more detail at the skippers. Our golden skippers, as we call them, the large, the small, and the Essex. Bad news for 2021. They were almost universally down in count, and you can see, although it's less obvious on the than some species, that the number of transects is slightly down, but you can see it in the counts, they are quite a bit down. So what this tells you is there's quite a lot of variation, and you saw that sheet that Katherine had, lots of red and lots of green. Do apologize, it's a bit jarring on the eyes, but it gives you an idea of, there's a lot of variation. Any biological creature has a lot of variation. Habitats vary because this is habitats throughout the whole of Yorkshire. So you'll have heaths, you'll have dry limestone, chalk grasslands on steep slopes. You'll have Vale of York land near the river, which floods on a regular basis. So there's a huge variety of habitats here. So you do have to expect a good deal of variation, which is why we need as many transects as we have, is to figure out patterns that are going on. So the skippers are most definitely down, but worse than that, if you look at the short term and the long term change, they're also well down. There's definitely, they're on the down. And if you look over in Europe, it's a similar situation to an extent that even small skipper in Holland is now almost absent, but it's been replaced by Essex skipper. So a good reason to monitor and try and figure out Essex skippers and small skippers, which is very difficult, is we could be missing significant trends if we don't measure those two species. Dingy skipper, obviously, it's not such a common species. It's been slightly down this year, up last year in the good spring, and overall, it's only a small change, slightly down. Now, probably some of the highlights of this year is the orange tip and the brimstone. Now, even though their flight periods were very, very poor, the reason we're able to assess that they actually did quite well is because we only walk, the pollard walk is only walked in good conditions. So we actually get a realistic assessment of a species, regardless of whether the weather was really bad or poor. And the results of that is you can see orange tip and brimstone both had good years, which was quite a surprise. You also see the long term on brimstone is definitely benefiting from the spread of its host plant, which, you know, the host plant, which is the buckthorn, is spreading north. We're also planting it in Yorkshire. And the orange tip is most definitely short term, having a bit of a boom time. Now, the green vein white is an interesting one. There's a number of species that prefer damp conditions. And if you're familiar with the whites, you generally find green vein white likes shade, lusher grass, where crucifer is more likely to grow, and is much more damp, shady white. You can almost tell as soon as you walk in near trees, green vein white tends to become the major species. Again, not much change, slightly down. And we're thinking the reason for that is probably the drought of last year, which is quite distinct. If you remember 2020, the spring, the heat wave in particularly May, by the end of May, the grasses were looking yellow, the herbs were looking quite dried up, and we think there was quite a bit of mortality, and lots of species suffered as a result, especially the damp-loving species. And we'll see that later in the figures that the other damp lovers have also suffered. The two whites, although last year, 2020, they were both up in the good summer, this year they really didn't do well. There was less migration. Both these species do migrate and they will come over from the continent, but the early spring weather, I think, really did them in quite a lot. In the longer term, they're both not faring too well with global warming in the longer term. In the shorter term, 5-year term, they're actually doing quite well. I think because of the series of wet summers. Now I know this summer on and off is quite wet, but it's a cold spring, I think, which had the overriding factors. They were short on time. Usually small whites would get 3 generations. They really struggled to get the 3rd generation. Small tortoiseshells is a really interesting one in Yorkshire because we've had 2 years now of boom, and I mean a real boom, to the fact that it's now coming out at 3rd or 4th most common species on most transects. Overall, the long term since 1990 is well down, and still in the south of England, it's doing incredibly poorly. But in the north, it's having a boom. It's the opposite for the red admiral, which this year had a cracking summer in the south of England, but a poor one in Yorkshire. I think again, it's migration. The weather this year has not been conducive to migration. I guess the big highlight really of the year is our vanessids. So we're talking about the comma, the peacock, and the red admiral painted ladies. All had a really diabolical bad season. Comma now has had 2 really bad years, and it seems to be still on the way down. Peacock this year was poor, red admiral, and all these are having consecutive bad years. Again, we're not having those suns, we're not having, the population of all these species tend to be supplemented by migrants coming in from the continent. Moving on to the fertilities, the large fertilities, which is a good news story for Yorkshire. We've seen some, considering they only appeared in 2016 in about 2 locations, they've become highly mobile species spreading through the county, particularly 2019, where it appeared almost in any woodland in Yorkshire could see silver washed, and they were obviously in an explorative phase. We had very large numbers occur in a couple of locations, and they spread and settled, and they've kind of congregated in a few key areas. So for example, the transect that I walk, which is Bishop Wood, which is Selby, for five full weeks of this summer, silverwash fertility was the commonest butterfly on the transect. which I've never experienced before. Normal counts would be up near 100 for each time I walked it. Who would have thought a southern species would suddenly become a very common species, at least in my local area. It's also present in Bramham, the woodlands around Bramham on the Limestone Ridge, also in Newtondale, that's the vale up from Pickering. There's also colonies near Ripon on the Skell and the Laver, where it's become established. And other bits, you can see it almost anywhere. And your transect results tend to confirm that it can pop up just about anywhere. It's obviously still in its explorative phase of its spread into. This is really the first time it's arrived in Yorkshire in force since the 19th century. So we have to go back to the warm spells of the end of the 19th century to find anything equivalent. Dark green fertility is also behaving in a similar way. It's spreading rapidly. You can see it in all kinds of places. The populations are up. You see the long-term trends here really are positive. They're really on the up. They're spreading up the Limestone Ridge presently. And I think they should reach Ripon, I think, probably this next year. Obviously, it's always been established on the Yorkshire Dales, on the limestone sites there, and similar sites on the Yorkshire moors. But this year, I'm glad to report, it's made it onto Fodden Chalkbank, one of our new transects this year, and it's in very good numbers. I'm staggered at what Kerry's been seeing over in Fodden. Moving on to the Lysinids, they had a pretty poor year, and one in particular had a diabolical year. The Holly Blue, I think, is absolutely hit the bottom to the fact that this last, they have 2 generations in a year. The second generation was the first time we actually saw some increasing numbers. So predictions for next year, hopefully we'll see an improvement. If you look at the long-term figure, 300% rise, they're definitely being driven by global warming, but the short term it's down. Now it suffers with a parasite, which is and it goes through cycles, around about 4 to 5 year cycle. And we think we've hit the bottom, so hopefully it's now going up. But the blues in particular have had a bad time, and the small copper, not good. We haven't had a good summer. Basically with the blues and the small copper, they need a good summer. That's when they really proliferate. They can get an extra generation in. Small copper will do 3 generations easily. They're not getting the opportunities with the summers we've had. Brown Argus is an interesting one. It's on the up in the short term, and it was up this year. And the Northern Brown Argus had an exceptional year this year. Now there's a regional effect here, because the northwest of the county had a much better summer than us people down off these flatlanders like me down in the Vale of York. Actually, the Yorkshire Dales had a cracking summer, and I think that shows in that figure there. Marble White, well, now we have for the first time really quite good monitoring with the new sites on the wolds, and we're beginning to see that it's actually on the increase, and in the long term it's on the increase. Short term it can suffer with drought, and that's, I think, reflected in that figure there. It's slightly down with the drought. The Speckled Wood is had a very bad year. As you can see, 16 of the transects were down, only 3 of them were up, so it's a very clear-cut picture with the Speckled Wood. And similarly with the ringlet, again, 13 down, 8 up, 9 in the middle, most definitely down. And ringlet obviously contributes, because it's a very common species, contributes a huge amount to the overall figures. So The reason we think these are down is the same reason as the green vein white. Both speckled wood ringlets tend to be, you find them in coarser grasses, shadier areas. They're damp lovers. And I think with the drought of 2020, the May drought, they're still really recovering from that drought. In contrast, the meadow browns and the gatekeepers and the small heath, particularly the small heath, have had good years. And you would say small heath in particular has had a series of really quite good years. It's definitely on the up. Overall, although you can say it's a pretty average year, 12 species up, 15 species down. So it's still more down than up. Overall, we are 3% down compared with the 5-year average. But as you saw the graph of the different years, actually this year, if you compared it, say, with 2016 and the previous 5 years, actually there's a significant increase. Our damp shade lovers have not really bounced back yet, but I think next year they probably will. And what will help them bounce back is this November of this year was quite dry, so we're kind of expecting that mortality over the winter will actually be quite good. So that's the picture, and let's just tie it together now into a simpler one, and just go through the key drivers in this whole butterfly process, and just think about what's been going on. So we've had a series of good years. The 2017-2019 period was one of the best periods since the mid-90s. And you have to go back to the mid-70s to find anything close to that peak. The reason, obviously, is we've had some cracking temperatures. 17 to 19, or 18 and 19 were particularly good butterfly summers. It's now slowed, but not hugely, even with a year like last year, which most of us will remember that June, the June with no butterflies. The other key factor we looked at is the 2020 drought that has had a significant effect on those that prefer the damper conditions. We've looked at the record-breaking spring 2020. That was partly responsible for the boom in the brimstones and the orange tips. Obviously, they're at the very best in the 2020. They really did enjoy those temperatures that we had at the beginning of lockdown. We probably all remember the beginning of lockdown, how good it was. And I also remember my buckthorn plants in my garden were completely stripped, right down to almost no leaves by brimstones, until the blue tits found that they had a ready source of food. I don't know how many made it through, but obviously, butterflies and moths are a big contributor to bird life. And I think one of the key things with birds this year is the lack of caterpillars during the crucial chick period of late May into June. The birds are really going to suffer because of the shortage of caterpillars. So the last 2 years we've had two fairly warm, cloudy, and all of us will remember how difficult it was this year. I mean, overall transect walking this year has been a bit of a nightmare. We've heard about the cold and the cold spring of April into May, but you probably all remember June, July into August was how often each day you get up, the sun's out, but by 10 o'clock when you're getting ready to go out to do your transect walk, the convective cloud bubbles up and it promptly goes really dark. An hour later, it starts to drizzle, but never actually does anything. So you hang around hoping, at which point around about 3 o'clock, when there's still another opportunity to have a walk before the end of the transect day, the sun then comes out, and there's a corking evening sun. And that seemed to be the pattern of our summer this year, and an increasing pattern these last 2 years of damp summers and the convective cloud. It's actually quite difficult to get a good, clear, sunny spell that you can predict when you're going to transect walk. So obviously the extremely poor spring of 2021 we've covered. Another key factor, 2 good late summers, which should really help the venesids, the hibernating species, the tortoiseshells and peacocks. And so far this year, after a very warm autumn last year, the numbers are quite good. Peacock numbers are not good because they had such a poor last year, but tortoiseshells though seem to be in abundance. Brimstones quite good. Contributing to that, also we've had 2 dryish Novembers. Even if they had been a little warm, they've been dry. That's been crucial for our overwintering ones. And lots of our species spend their autumn as caterpillars or eggs. The weather certainly this year has prevented lots of migration. Hence the Red Admiral has really suffered, not in the south of England, but in the north of England. Conclusions. 2017, 2019, best years since the mid-90s. 2021, slightly down on the 5-year average, but still a good year. Prospects. Although low numbers of hibernators went into the autumn, I think the survival will be good, because we've had no, like we had last year with the heat wave in March, when lots of our hibernators came out of hibernation and became active. They then had to suffer 2 months of extreme cold, wet, etc. And I think one of the big factors for their survival is they just didn't have enough. They just expended too much energy in March, and they just didn't make it through to breed. And the dry November should help our browns. So I'm hopeful about this year, but the proof will be in the eating. Holly Blue, we're hoping that will hit the bottom and start to see improvements. And the whites did stage a late recovery last year. Hopefully they'll make a better recovery this year. And the blues, the lysenids, the small copper, etc., it really does need a good summer to see things improve. And now a bit of controversy for you, because I like a little bit of controversy. What will be the next invading species? So I know I've spent a little bit of time this last summer, actually, and you might have joined Dennis Dell for his talk on Purple Emperor. It's getting close, chaps, and we're on the front line very much, especially those transects in the south of the county. The Emperor's coming, and I saw quite a few literally 5 miles from the Yorkshire border. Certainly in a number of places, they're now becoming very numerous. I'm talking about Sherwood Forest and surrounding area is proving very, very good habitat for the Purple Emperor. It has been, only by rumour, it has been seen in Yorkshire, but we have had no definite confirmations. But areas we're looking for it are areas like Maltby Low Common, which is a cracking site full of sallow. And that's what they really need, is a good abundance of sallow bushes, which are incredibly common in Yorkshire. And it's good to report that the Forestry Commission now used to treat sallow bushes as weeds because they always overgrew woodland rides. They're actually leaving them or coppicing them so they recover. So there's good news that they have habitat and they're not far away. So once all this data is crunched, as you've seen by Katherine, it then forms the basis of our site monitoring. And up on the screen at the moment is Bishop Wood, which is actually my transect. So I've done about 60 of these reports this year. If your site has had more than 1 year's data, you can go and look at your data on the website. So you just go under recording Transect Reports and you should find it. And what you'll see basically is the route we walk, the characteristics and habitats of the site, the different species and roughly whereabouts they occur, the sections that make up a transect. As you know, transects are divided into a number of sections, usually by habitat or some other indicator. And this sheet here shows you where each of the species occurs in each of the transects. So you get a much more better feel of what's what on your transect from that chart. Over here, you'll see the analysis. And what I do here is compare your data against the Yorkshire averages. So you begin to get a feel how you compare against. So you begin to see here typical, the skippers are down, which is typical, of course, of what we've seen. The brimstone is up, dingy is down, all typical, large white down, small white up, orange tip up, which we looked at before, which is common throughout York. Small tortoiseshell, the boom continues, and silverwash fertility. Unbelievable numbers that we saw there. I think we got in total for the whole year 350 insects we counted. Speckled woods were actually up. It is a very wet site and it was flooded this last spring. That might have helped the speckled wood survive, unlike other areas. Meadow brown's up, ringlet slightly up, and the total, interestingly, even with the weather we had last year, the totals are up. And I can take you on to other sites. I'm not going to. I'm going to stop at this point, and I'll just go back. I'm going to open it up now to our new transect walkers and give them a chance, because this meeting should really be about you, not about us, what we do, etc. It should be about you. It's for you to contribute and to share and to make comment. Hope you've enjoyed that presentation on the 2021 figures, and I'd like to now just look at some of the new transects. So I'm just going to come out of there, and excuse me while I just get my browser to go. And let's look at recording, Transect Reports. And I'm going to look first at an interesting one. It's new. I think we have the walkers with us. Let's just give me a second. Boron Quarry. Tiny postage stamp sized reserve on the Yorkshire Wolds. It's walked by Victoria Scone and Martin Phillips. I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to see who's with us and who's not with us, but I think Martin was with us at one point. He might like to just butt in and comment on what I'm going to say. But this is a new site, altogether new site. It's an old quarry, as you may be aware. It's been very much studied over the years. Martin Phillips has always, well, for a lot of years, has walked the site, studied the site, and has in a large way directed operations of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, who maintain it. It's famous for its dingy skipper, and each few years, I think it's on a 3-year cycle, a new scrape is made, roughly where my pointer is, scraping back the chalk to produce new habitat. And if you look at the counts for dingy skipper, then you'll begin to see this year's figures. If you look here, 72 dingy skippers, quite an outstanding quantity. But have a look at the total for a tiny postage stamp size reserve. Over the year had 1,750 butterflies. It has to be one of the richest, most dense butterfly sites in Yorkshire. Obviously it's very dry, it's chalky, it's been there a good long time, lots of plants, it's carefully managed and cut, and new bits they try and create new areas, like over here, they're trying to create new grassland. It'll be interesting to see in the following years how this performs. Is anybody out there would like to comment? Victoria or Martin? I'm afraid I can't see if you're there.
This is Martin here.
Hi, Martin. Would you agree with my comments? Would you like to comment?
Yes, I think it's very interesting that you say it's one of the most highly dense butterfly sites in the county. That's very good news. And dingy skipper is definitely one of the key species there. And
I see wall as well, which is good news.
Yes, just the odd occasional one. Yeah. And other features is the marbled white, which perhaps if you went there 20, 25 years ago, you'd hardly see one, and they're now pretty common.
Yeah. So they're the second most common species. So after meadow browns, 600, marbled white, 283, which is quite staggering number, and to be the second most common species. Thank you, Martin. I'm going to move on to the next site. So I'm going to look now at Sprotborough. I think Mark Davis, are you there? Maybe he's not there. I'll assume he's not there. So Sprotborough Flash, a Yorkshire Wildlife Reserve on the River Don. This is the River Don here. Interesting little place with a very special history of it's kind of created by mining substance, because we're in mining territory. It actually subsided into the flash, which is here. It just subsided and sunk from mining works, creating the flash. But the really interesting bit is that it's in the gorge of the Don. So this is magnesium limestone. So you're on the magnesium limestone ridge. And there's some nice, interesting limestone species that occur in this area, the grassland area. But you also got the woodland area as well. So just to give you an idea of the species, not huge counts. but it's nice to see marble whites coming through. The inevitable silver wash fritillary coming through from probably just a wanderer from the local area. Small heath in small numbers. Just a pretty typical set of figures. Moving on to another new one, which has to be my very first site that I visited when I came to Yorkshire many, many years ago, which is Brockerdale. And it's the first time we've had a transect there, so we can actually see not only the number of species, but how many of the species. So the transect goes into the woodland from the car park through the little kind of the meadow in the middle of the woods, which is where all the action with the fertilities happens. Particularly that's the breeding site of the dark green fritillary. And I think Paul was with us, and maybe Les is with us. Would you like to say anything, either?
Yeah,
hi there, Paul here.
That sounds like Paul.
Yeah. Yes, as you said, Paul here last year. We've been recording butterflies in Brockerdale for, I don't know, nearly 20 years, but we don't cover the same, or we didn't cover the same area each time we walked through. And it was a much bigger area. So we're a bit sort of unsure about the advantages of a transect in terms of telling us what the Brockerdale butterflies are, because we're missing some chunks of reserve in just doing the transect. So there are pluses and minuses. We can see the advantages of a fixed walk over over the long term.
Yeah.
But we've got to get used to this this new system and sort of somehow try and fit in wider recording in the reserve.
Okay. But I hope to see the value in terms of the long-term trends that we can plot, and I hope with time, certainly next year, Paul, we'll be able to do a report and actually look at whatever's changing. And just to look at your species, I mean, it's a huge list of species that you have. It's one of the, next to Ellerburn Bank, probably you have one of the widest range of species in Yorkshire.
We've always claimed, yes.
Yeah, which is the reason I went there in the first place. It was the known best spot to see butterflies in Yorkshire. In fact, for me, it was the only spot until I learned a good deal more. And it's a huge range that you have. The silver wash fritillary is breeding there by the looks of it. The numbers certainly suggest that. And I hear you have a new visitor.
I'm not sure what.
Oh, okay. That you might have seen the small blue.
Oh, well, we haven't seen it. I don't know.
We'll see.
I'm not sure. Well, we'll keep our eyes open. It has been mentioned, but we haven't seen it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next.
Well, it might just.
I'll move on to the next site. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to move to Fodden Chalkbank. Forden, sorry. I never know how to say it. I try and pronounce it like like the locals, but I get it wrong. Okay, if you've not been there, it is a cracking site. It's where the conservation team work most winters. We normally spend half our winter at Fodden doing scrub clearance, etc., creating habitat. We first took it on about 7 or 8 years ago. working from the west side towards the east, and it's taken 5 years. This year we set about doing this east half, particularly after Kerry, who's our walker there, found that most of our species occur anywhere along particularly the southern half of the site. This is a steep slope. It's a steep slope in the wolds. It's a dry valley. It faces due south. Very typical. It usually has some of the earliest sightings of our species, particularly war is common. Dingy skipper is common. And now, these last 2 years, the dark green fertility has moved in some numbers. Obviously, it's also well known for brown argus because a lot of these slopes are very rich in rock rose, as is Brocadale, by the way. And that is the food plant of the regular brown argus. As you may be aware, there's kind of 3 different types of brown argus to make life more interesting. So we have the brown argus that has lived on the wolds and the moors for a lot of years, either 1 or 2 generations a year, and its food plant has always been strictly rock rose. And then around about the turn of the millennium, they began to occur in the southern areas of Yorkshire, so just the tip of South Yorkshire, and began to spread northwards in kind of short pushes northwards each year, to now they just about cover the whole of Yorkshire, and they're using a different food plant. They're using dove's foot cranesbill, one of the cranesbill family. It will lay eggs on any of the cranesbill family, but its favorite at the moment is dove's foot. It's a common plant, an agricultural weed in some places. On the farm where I live, it occurs wherever there's sandy sand drifts in the Vale of York, particularly on stewardship belts. It's a common plant. So the other third type of brown argus is the northern brown argus, which you've heard has had a very good year this year. It only occurs in the upper dales, but we now reach the situation all 3 of these are beginning to come together in the valleys further up the valleys of the big rivers in Yorkshire. All 3 species are beginning to meet, and we really don't know what's going to be the end result. So are they going to breed? Is one going to win? We haven't got a clue. So it will be interesting. The counts at Fodden are very high. It's a very rich area. And you can see there the total count. I think it may be the highest in the county, nearly 2,600 butterflies through the season. Great to see. It's nice to have that. And thanks, Kerry, for doing it. Kerry, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, so locals call it Forden. And sorry, no, non-locals call it Forden, and proper locals call it Fodden.
Okay.
So it's Fodden. So you're right.
I'm right. Okay, that's amazing.
You're right.
Even in a Wiltshire accent.
Even in a Wiltshire accent. Did you get that from Mike?
I think I got it from Alan.
Yeah, that figures.
Yeah, Alan Rold is our conservation officer for Yorkshire. Yeah, carry on.
So I was really just going to say that yeah, in terms of early sightings, I think we got brown argus, dingy skipper, and small heath. That all 3 were the earliest sightings in Yorkshire. On Fodden. I was there on Friday. It was 16 degrees.
Yeah.
Didn't see anything, but yeah, it's a great site. Well worth visiting, but very, very steep.
Very, very steep. Thank you, Kerry. let's move on. So let's go to Sun Lane. So this is an old transect that we've restarted this year. So this is one of the 2021. If I can find it, there it is. And I think Nairi and I think Janet they're both with us tonight. It's an interesting site. Kerry, Nairi, would you like to take over from me?
Hello.
Hi, Nairi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think Janet's just left, she put a message on, so yeah, it was walked sort of unofficially since about 2004, but it was always walked as a single section and not split into sections. So this is the first year we've actually got it split into the 6 sections and done it officially, where we've recorded all the temperatures and the wind speeds and all that data, which was never recorded before, but it's still been the same route that's been walked all those years. So we have got quite a bit of data for it. It's only quite a small site again. It was an old tip. All sorts of rubbish were dumped there, some of it quite toxic, I believe. But there's a lovely grassland area and we've got buddleias there, and we've got all the buckthorn there. We get good for brimstones. We had good numbers of small tortoiseshell there this year. So yeah, be interesting. We actually had purple hairstreak there, but it was just outside the 5 metre box.
5 metre rule. Okay.
But we got a holly blue there and a wall.
Yeah, I see the wall, which is good.
Yeah, that was. I don't know is it just one holly blue? Yeah, we saw holly blue. Janet actually walked it more times than us. We didn't actually get started for about first 6 weeks, did we? Because we were just setting it up. So we missed about the first 6 weeks. So probably when all the bad weather was anywhere. But
true, I don't think we missed a lot. We've missing those first weeks.
I think we didn't miss many weeks after that. Janet walked it slightly more than us. I think we did it about 6 times, and she probably did it about 12 or 13 or something. But yeah. It'd be interesting to see what this year brings. Janet's seen brimstone there last week, so I might even go walk it as a week minus something if it's not this week.
Yeah, I think I'm going to put one in the bank this next week, just in case the weather goes bad. Okay, we'll move on.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's go to Nosterfield. I think Jill was with us.
Hi, Nick. Yes, I'm here. Although I don't actually walk Nosterfield.
It's your home territory, isn't it?
It's my home territory, so I can talk about it, but I don't actually walk it. I do the new one at Fountains Abbey.
Okay.
Yeah. This actually is the restored area of quarry which the Lower Eel Conservation Trust manages on behalf of Tarmac. And it's restored sand and gravel quarry. The top left-hand corner is reed bed. And there's a lot of work going on the big lake sort of top of the screen. Flask slate, we're planting up there with all sorts of lost species, native species, which we're growing on in a polytunnel. So hopefully that might see all sorts of things, attracting all sorts of things. It's been done by a chap who's been recording butterflies on site for probably about 10 years. He's a birder, but he's really big into his butterflies. And we invited him to do the transect, and he jumped at the chance, which is fantastic. And what we'd like to do is link it in with Nosterfield Nature Reserve, which is a mile down the road, which is the sort of start of everything. But we've seen dark green fritillary, although they have been in the area. Actually, you say they're coming to Ripon. They've actually been at one site in Ripon for about 20 years.
Really?
Nearby, yeah. Just a very.
You've been up on the hills?
No, another gravel pit. Very
really?
Close to Nosterfield. Yeah, they've been there for about 20, 25 years. But there aren't any transects down there. But brown Argus is coming very recently. We're very lucky also to have, although it's not mentioned on there. Certainly on the main reserve, as we call it, which is just down the road, we do have populations of both white letter and purple hair streak there as well. So that's something we need to do is get that one up and running too.
Are your brown Argus geranium eaters or rock rose?
They'll be the geranium.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's quite a large number for. Typically with brown Argus on geranium species, you only get small numbers.
Yes. They've just gone up and up and up over the last 10 years. They've really increased in numbers. It's been amazing.
Interesting. Okay. Right, we'll move on to next one. So Alethorpe Common. I think Steve, I did see Steve earlier. I don't know if he made it through all the troubles and is still with us. Are you there, Steve?
Hi, Nick. Yes, both myself and Penny are here.
Oh, good. I'm glad you made it through all the commotion.
It's been quite entertaining.
Okay. This is new this year. Really happy to have another lowland heath site to supplement Strensall and Cally Heath, which we covered last year.
Like ours is a circuit where you're not going to be counting the same butterflies over again. But I'm not sure about some of those others, like the Forden Bank and Warren Quarry. I think they'll count the same butterflies twice.
Sorry, who is that, please? Somebody not on mute. Just check your mute is on, please. Thank you. Steve?
Hello.
Would you like to just describe a little bit about the history of the site and your walk?
Yeah, the majority of the transect is actually in Alethorpe Woods, which is a Forestry England owned and managed plantation. It skirts along Alethorpe Common, which is the YWT reserve, during one of the sections. It's fairly typical pine, Forestry England habitat, lots of bracken, but there are some quite a lot of creeping willow.
Yeah, and also
I can hear Penny in the background.
Oh, Penny's here.
I'm here.
You're gonna have to speak up a lot, Penny.
Oh, sorry. That's having like the limestone.
Yes, but because it's a fairly intensively managed site in terms of forestry, they import quite a lot of limestone chippings on the main drives.
Yes.
Which, when it then spreads to the verges, is producing some quite interesting habitat for dingy skippers and the like, as a byproduct, so to speak.
Okay.
It's a commercially run area, most of it, and suffers obviously from management that's not necessarily sympathetic, but it's interesting, and as you say, it also encompasses one of the two lowland heath areas that we have.
I think it's
I'm afraid we can't hear you, Penny. You're gonna have to get very close to the microphone.
If the trees hadn't been planted on that site, I can't believe it, it would have been absolutely magnificent as a lowland heath, but it's been turned over to forestry and only a very tiny section of it is now common. But we do have glowworms there because we go down the moth trapping and we've discovered that there are glowworms there.
Very nice.
So that is such a good thing. It's the best thing I've discovered on that site. It's my favourite.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Because some of it's a bit of a butterfly desert, and we included those bits.
It's curious you get marble white as well.
Yes.
On a heathland.
Yes.
The marbled white, we discovered that marbled white does float down from the walls.
Yeah.
So in a good summer, in a very hot, you know, when it was the peak season, when everything just kicked off, we had marbled white coming down onto the round the York bypass. We saw it on the, and also on obviously on Allerthorpe, and also we get it on Speckled Common too.
Yeah.
So it does, they do float down, don't they?
Because we're only, as the butterfly floats, about 6 miles from Millington.
Yes.
Where at peak times last year we had hundreds, literally hundreds of marbled whites.
Yes.
I mean,
I think
300 and 400 at a time.
I think you can say anywhere in that area with grassland is will get visits from marble white. And I noticed from a lot of these new transects, you get odd marble whites coming through. It seems to be quite a mobile species, much more than people think it is. And it's quite capable of traveling. 6 miles would certainly not be a challenge to it. Certainly
especially as it's downhill and downwind.
Yeah, the railway embankments to the south of York on the main line, a lot of the bridges where they've used limestone to build the bridge is super habitat, and quite often you see good numbers of marble white there. Interesting.
Yeah,
okay,
we got a fair spread.
Indeed.
Of species for the first year, and we hope to improve on it as time goes on. We've already had Brimston, Red Admiral, Tortoiseshell, because we walk the Transect whether we're recording or not.
And we shouldn't forget the wider countryside scheme, which I very briefly described at the beginning. It's where random squares are chosen throughout the county. And I think we have 4 WCBS squares, including myself. I walk one, it's about a half a mile from my house. I'm very lucky that it's so close. Most people have 20 or 30 or even 40 miles to travel. I think Alex Bosman was come, and I did see him earlier. Are you there, Alex?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, thank you, Alex. I don't know your site at all. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's sort of, it's an upland area in Halifax, which is a mix of woodland and grassland. It's quite sparsely populated as far as butterfly numbers go, but a reasonable diversity within that. And I've been doing it for, I think it's about a decade now.
Gosh, thank you very much. Is David Phillips around?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, David. Nice to have you.
Yeah,
You're
sure.
all the way up in the north from near Richmond, aren't you?
Yeah, well, a bit of an interloper actually. I'm Lancastrian by birth and I live in County Durham, but just off the passport and the the visa, look across the border and do a survey, a wider countryside butterfly survey round Dalton-on-Tees, what used to be the old Croft Aerodrome, and
which is now a racetrack.
So yeah, near the racetrack.
Which is Croft Racetrack, by the way, for those who are familiar with racing.
It's really predominantly arable farm with a few sheep, some cattle. It's just expanded this last year and bought out the adjoining farm, and so there'll be more cattle on the farm. About 16 species of butterfly. Fairly good numbers of wall brown is probably the highlight. Common blue, small copper, the whites, of course, and brown argus is on the site. It's fairly low numbers of brown argus and low numbers of common blue, but they are holding their own. There's also 4 large oak trees just on the edge of the survey area, and they've actually got purple hair streak in them.
Okay, thank you. I think you told me you were thinking about doing another square this coming year.
Yes, I'm looking actually possibly there's Durham as well, because we've lost one or two recorders in Durham, so I'm not sure yet whether it be Durham or Yorkshire side.
Okay.
I've just got to wait and see at the moment.
Okay, so I know there's a square, vacant square at Gilling West.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks.
Is Andy Sumner with us still? I think I saw him earlier.
Hi.
Hi, Andy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. How's
Great.
it go? How's it going up at Malham?
So it's Crake Moor, so very close to Malham, so just north of Long Preston, west of Ayrton. So it's a site that's partly on semi-improved grassland and partly on open access moorland that's sometimes grazed by Highland cattle and sometimes isn't. So you can sometimes encounter them at relatively short distances if the grass is quite high. So quite an interesting place to walk. And very damp very often, so lots of green vein white, lots of small heath, lot of meadow brown last year, not many ringlets last year.
Yeah, the ringlets seem to be still having to recover. Any signs of green hair streak?
No, I've never seen any there. I think the grass is really long, and I've not seen any of the food plants around.
Thank you, Andy. Should we do low ox? Is Nairi still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Good, thank you. Now you've got a cracking little spot for your survey at Low Ox. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
It is quite interesting because it's the two sections are basically two sort of almost totally different habitats, because the first line that I do is sort of through grassland and farmland grazed by sheep, quite short grass, not overly rich in flower species. And then I climb up a hillside, and I don't know if anybody knows Kilnsey, or there's Mastiles Lane, sort of on the slopes of Kilnsey Crag. And then we've got lots of rock rose, we get northern brown argus, small heath, things like that, which I don't think I'd ever be likely to see a northern brown argus on the first section, and it's in the same 1 kilometre square. So it is quite interesting. And then it finishes off by going along the road that goes through Kilnsey, and then the final section is across field again, grassland, quite heavily grazed with sheep. Don't usually see much in there at all, to be fair, maybe an odd meadow brown, that's about it. But the sort of sections 6 to 8 are fantastic for northern brown argus, common blue, small heath.
I think it's important to say with the wider countryside scheme, you're liable to encounter everything, and it's important that when you design design your route, you design it so that you encounter as many different habitats on your square as you can fit in, because the idea is to try and get a good average of all the habitats in that area. And having zero is just as important as having lots of northern brown argus. It's always nice to have them, but it's just as important to have zero, in my opinion. So thank you very much. That concludes all the new folks and the wider countryside, and we've got a few minutes left to round up. And I'd like to open the floor now to anybody really who's got questions, wants to comment about my reports, which I'm sure obviously I can only see from the numbers, and you obviously walk them, and you will know a heck of a lot more than I do about what's happening on your site, and whether you would like to make any comments, ask any questions. Now's your chance to ask them, or if it's just a general comment about walking, problems you have with walking your transect, the rules, the pollard walk rules, which are necessarily, because of what we do, have to be quite strict rules, which always turns up questions like, what do you do if it rains halfway round? Should I come back and carry on from that point the next day, or do I start again? The answer is, if you don't complete, you start afresh completely. That's really important. If you walk 2 walks in a week, don't expect it to take the highest. What it does is it takes the average of your 2 walks. So you're free to walk as many times as you like, but it will only ever use the average of those. Okay, any questions, or is there anything in the chat box, Katherine?
Yeah, there's a question from Steve Ralph.
I can hardly hear you, Katherine. Get
tell
nearer.
How the BTO squares are incorporated into the results?
Okay, yes. So the British Trust for Ornithology and Butterfly Conservation, WCBS is a joint scheme. We don't see the figures from the BTO, but they are all come together at head office. Both schemes come together. There's roughly twice as many BTO surveyors as there are butterfly surveyors. But the great thing about it is it gives birders something to do in the summer when there's not very many birds. They count butterflies. But fortunately, we haven't been asked to count birds in the winter. But it is mutually beneficial in that we're able to cover a lot more squares and utilize the resource of all those walkers on the BTO square scheme. Exactly the same scheme. You basically take a kilometre square and draw two lines on it, basically, 2 1 kilometre walks across that square. It could be 2 vertical, it could be 2 horizontal, or it can be irregular. I find it a very difficult scheme. I can see how it works for birders, because wherever they walk, they can see birds, but that does not apply to butterflies. So most of the ones in Yorkshire tend to land slap in the middle of a barley field. And I don't think farmers are too happy about people like us plodding our way through their barley fields just for the sake of having a nice straight line. So most of ours work with the hedgerows, and when you think about it, actually, it's logical that if we walked across a barley field, what would we actually see? I would suggest in Yorkshire, you see, I won't be rude, but I could be, you see nothing. But if you walk along the margins or the hedgerows, usually on the roadsides or the path sides, you get a whole rich variety of species. And actually, a better representation of what's in that square is basically a hedgerow survey. Certainly on mine, you get purple hair streaks, holly blues, loads of gatekeepers, a huge variety of things. And as you've heard, the species range is quite big. And I think that's how it should be done. I divert a little bit, Katherine. Anything else?
No, that's it. Any more questions?
Excellent. And the survey results, Katherine, have you had a chance to look what species people have real difficulty with?
There's 2 groups of answers: skippers and whites.
Skippers and whites.
Well, whites on the move, not just whites stationary, but whites on the move.
Okay. It's 9:30. Can I suggest I just whiz through this and then you butt in with your ideas on those two groups of species? So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Let's do whites. Now, everybody has difficulty with the 5 different types of white butterflies. And you know, brimstone, it's very easy when it's a bright yellow male, but life gets difficult with the females because females are basically white. And it's a similar size to large whites. And I think when I was taught, because Terry Crawford, I think, might be with us, but Terry, and this is actually Terry's slide, and thank you very much, Terry, for allowing the branch to use your presentation.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, Terry. I hope you don't mind.
No,
but you taught me, and I'm very grateful for all the tricks and things that you taught me. But one of the key ones that Terry taught me was attitude is a good indicator for the whites. And certainly the brimstone and the large white are very similar in attitude. What Terry means is large whites usually set off in a particular direction. And they're moderately straight in their flight. They don't flutter around. They don't, they have purpose. They have attitude. They know where they're going. And it's pretty much with the brimstone. They'll spend a lot of time darting from flower to flower, dead straight lines. Males in particular, they're on patrol, particularly at the moment, this time of the year, because the females aren't quite out yet. They will be in the next few days. So you only see males at this time. Females will arrive usually, if you have buckthorn in your garden, as I do, usually when the little shoots are about a centimetre, little buds on the end are about a centimetre long, is usually about the time when the females come out. Of course, they've overwintered as virgins, and the first thing they obviously need is a male, and they're busy hunting at the moment. But the way to tell them is the female, which is large white, as I say, is a pale green, a whitish pale green. And the other things you can see, and usually if they slow when they're landing onto the flower, you'll see the points on their wings. And if you're lucky, you'll just get a glimpse of the little orange spots in the middle of each of their forewings and hindwings. And this beautiful deep raspberry red eyes and antenna. As soon as it lands, you know exactly what it is from the shape, the color, the spots, etc. So let's move on to another one of the whites. So I didn't know which ones you're going to pick, so I put a load in. So large white, most characteristic is large. In flight, it's quite white, but the underside is a lemony yellow, and that does show, as it does for the small white. You get this lemony color. The other characteristic is the black is very black, and it wraps around the edge of the wing. So the point wraps around both sides and is quite broad and definitely black. And then you have the size and the attitude, the speed of it. Okay, and the small white. First thing you notice the difference is that black area is very different. It doesn't wrap around. Black just goes straight across from just before the middle of the forewing, straight line. Coloration is quite variable in the small white. Usually the colors are a good deal paler. They vary through the season. The flight, much more fluttery, much more random. The markings, they vary with the season. So usually the first brood is quite small and pale marks. So the ones we'll see in the next few weeks will not have strong marks. The later ones are larger and much stronger marks. And you know the difference between a male and a female. The male has one spot on its forewing, female has two spots. Green vein white. When it's flying, the first thing to say is habitat. The habitat in which it flies. So you usually see it associated with damp areas. Hedgerows bottoms, for example, where it's food plant, largely hedge mustard. It will take other crucifers, has quite a wide range, while the cabbage whites, they are pretty much, well, obviously there's the cabbages in your garden, but out there in the wider countryside, they're basically, if they don't get poisoned by pesticide, they're living on the oilseed rape. Their food plants is restricted to brassicas. Although this year I found small white living on hairy bittercress, a small agricultural weed, so it can survive on other species. Green vein white, first characteristic is in flight, it's generally has the least attitude of them all, the most random, the weakest flight, the early spring, it can be very small, quite variable in size. If you see a very small white fluttering near a damp area or anywhere near woodland, you can pretty much guarantee it's a green vein white, even if you never see it landed. Obviously with the others, you really need to see them landed to be sure which species, or at least resting to see which it is. Obviously with the green vein white, it's not actually green at all, it's actually, the veins are actually black, but black on lemony yellow shows as a green color. The tip of the wing is similar to the small white in that it doesn't wrap around the tip of the wing. And also coming in from the edges of the forewings, you see these little black scales in little lines down the side, which is quite characteristic. Again, you have the two spots of the female, one spot of the male, and that's the underside, which probably we're all familiar with. So what do you do when you're on a transect and you've got a mixture of all these, and sometimes you can probably tell a large white fairly easily, although you could be a small large white and a big small white look pretty much the same. How do you go about figuring which is which when you've got large numbers that you need to count? Well, what you do with these difficult ones where you're not quite sure is just carefully look at 2 or 3. And if you're finding 50% of them are green veined and 50% of them small white, then you just adjust your numbers accordingly as you walk that section, rather than trying to really stretch your brain and figure every single insect in infinite detail, that you use a simple averaging system. And you kind of, as you move between habitats, just reset that figure. Certainly as you go from sunny open spaces to shady areas, inevitably you'll see much more green vein whites that you have to adjust. And that's how I do it, and I think that's how most walkers do it. So the other species of white obviously is the orange tip, and the female, which we're familiar with, is white. And yes, it wraps around, the black wraps around the corner, just as they do with the large, the green vein white, and the two are very easily confused. But one outstanding feature is this black dot in the middle of the forewings. Is quite characteristic. Also the shape of this wing is rounded at the edge. It's quite distinct. In flight it's more difficult. You will see the mottling on the underside, which is here. Obviously, it's a characteristic. You see here the green vein. This is definitely much darker. You also got the advantage, you only need to know about this during the flight season of orange tip. In other words, up into about the middle of June, do you have to worry which one of these it is? But it's well worth just checking that. Just waiting for it to alight, and then you can easily see from the underside which species. Anybody want to add anything to any tips to my commentary? You're very welcome. I mean, this is what this session is all about, really. Is we've got a lot of inexperienced and new starters, and we've got some really old, very professional people here. Anybody want to add any tips? Gosh, I hope that was useful then, if nobody. Okay, let's move on now. What was the other one, Katherine? Was it the skippers?
I think the smaller skippers, not the large skipper.
Okay. Okay. This one gets people a lot, which is the brown Argus and the female common blue. How do you tell them apart? There's some stuff here which shows you exactly. I always go by the color, chocolate brown. The lunules, these are the little orange crescents on, are always orange. There's never any white in them, and there's never any sign of blue. There's sometimes some bluish hairs on the body, but there's no blue scales actually on the wing. The walls sometimes get confused with Fertilities. Large skipper, small skipper, easily. At the beginning of the season, they quite often get confused. I notice a number of our transect walkers have trouble. The best indicator is spots. If it has spots, it's simple. It's a large skipper, full stop. Top side, underside, they've got the spots. See the spots, it's large. It's obviously a larger butterfly. If you're very close, you also get to see that large skipper has the antenna have a point on them. So the real conundrum, I think it's important as the reasons I explained, is telling small and Essex skippers apart. I think it drives us all potty. It drives the recorders potty. Lots of photographs of antenna tips, and it's difficult. I'll go into a bit more detail next. So this is a really quite in-depth guide to the difference between the small skippers. So we have the spotty skipper, the large skipper, and his pointed antenna, and then you have the Essex and the small. And the characteristic way they're held apart is you've got the browny yellowy tip of a small skipper, and dipped in ink is the usual expression people use. It's only the underside of the antenna that appears to be dipped in deep black ink, no brown at all. So even if you took a photograph and blew it up, which a lot of us do, and we spend a lot of the season blowing up photographs of small skipper antennas, so many of the ones we look at are not truly black. They have bits of brown in, and it takes a macro image really to sort that out, which I know in the field is completely useless diagnostic system. So in my opinion, tips are good if you want to know for definite if you've got Essex on your site. Start with tips, take some photos, some macro images, send them to your recorder. Make sure you got them. But I think from that point, you've got to use other techniques as well as the tip color. But that is the classic way of telling them apart. And the line is distinct. The line between the black and the pale of the tip is as a clear cut. But I can tell you 90% of the pictures you take, it doesn't even show as a color difference, which makes it really quite difficult. So the backup system and the way you can really get a little bit more to grips with these two species is the brand, the sex brand of the males. Obviously, you can only do it with males, and you can see the difference here. That this is small Sylvestris is the small skipper. It has a long, quite distinct sex brand, and it kinks, very slight kink in the midpoint, as the red line here shows the image. The Essex has a much shorter, paler brand, and is actually, it's split into two little bits. That is quite distinctive, but difficult to see in the field, because as you can see there, it's quite tricky. So you need to see a number to be sure. So my tip is start with the antenna tips, then to confirm, move to the sex brand. There's lots of other things you can look for, but on their own, they just don't stand up. So you can see these pictures. That's Essex. It's a slightly more golden brown. It's 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks later than the small. So you can't really start looking for Essex till the latter part of the small skipper season. And the band around the outside, which is always darker in both species, is actually broader in the Essex. And also you get these darker lines coming in from the edge. Again, it's not characteristic. You see the broader band. So you've got to put these bits of evidence together. And of course, the other thing I'm encouraging you to do is first discover it. Is it on your site? And get that confirmed by your recorder. At the moment, you can say that it's reached basically, and probably going to pass, if Dave Ramson's here, he'll correct me, but it's reached up the River Ouse to about Wetherby kind of area going north. It's gone round the coast a little bit from Spurn, where it first occurred, and it's also coming down from Saltburn and the Middlesbrough area, coming south. And in some of those southern sites, I've also walked a transect on Thorn Moors, which is just the side of Doncaster. And I would say they're probably, Essex has now reached about 50-50. And as I was saying, in Holland, the Essex is beginning to take over from the small skipper. And I can just about imagine in 20 years' time that could easily be the case in Yorkshire, that it will begin to become the dominant skipper. At the moment, it's not showing any dramatic signs of moving quickly through the rest of the county, but it's definitely moving. Anybody got any more tips on it or comments?
Just a general observation, Nick, is that Essex.
Who are you? Who is it?
It's Essex was recorded in Darlington this year on meadows bordering the River Tees. So it's actually moved inland from Teesside, spreading sort of westwards along the Tees.
Yeah.
So if anybody's doing any surveys around the sort of North Yorkshire, Durham border, just keep an eye open for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we've seen anything Scarborough way as of yet, but places like Fodden might pick it up. or even the tabular hills might be soon be invaded very soon.
Yeah.
And you can imagine it spreading through the Vale of York quite quickly. So anybody in the Vale of York, you really want to be watching out. Just watch those tips. Certainly in my time on Thorne Moors, I used tips quite a bit. I was quite inexperienced at the time, but tips were pretty characteristic. That you get this clear division between the milky, the ink black and the paler color. If you see that clear line, it's most definitely an Essex. But the trouble is, you get old small skippers, they have dark antennas, and it gets very difficult because the line disappears. Okay, I think we'll call a close unless Katherine's got any more questions.
No, I think that's everything.
Everything? Good. Well, I'd just like to thank everybody. It's been nice. I'm sorry about all the troubles and my slightly nervous start. I do apologize. Absolutely everything went wrong tonight. And wish you all a good hunting this season. And hope to see you all back next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.